for a couple folks to get seats, and then we're going to begin. As everyone probably at this point knows, I'm Dr. Nathan Ty. I'm the organizer of our Brown Bag Lecture Series here at the Kearney Public Library, now in its 6th year. I'm not a historian, so I don't know time. And we are very excited to continue our partnership with the Kearney Public Library as the co-sponsor of our monthly lecture series. We have a couple of events upcoming just to direct your attention to. Our next talk in the series, which is going to be on September 11th, is going to be Dr. David Vail talking about a conservation, civil defense, natural disasters, and agriculture in the Cold War Great Plains, which is the subject of his upcoming book on the Cold War agriculture. In October, on October 9th, it'll be me, and appropriate for Halloween, it's going to be Death and Dying in Buffalo County. That's a really positive subject matter. As always, please stay in touch with the history department. We're on all the requisite social media sites. We have information about the department at the back table, and ways to both support our students and support the research and the work that they do throughout the year, and particularly upcoming now as our academic year starts in a week and a half. We're very excited for students to be back in a week and a half. I know the faculty in the room, the administrators are slightly terrified. But today, we are very, very excited to have Dr. William Stoutamire, Associate Professor here in the History Department. He coordinates our undergraduate public history minor and our online MA in public history. His research focuses on early museums in the American West, with particular interests in how museums shape community identity, as we'll see today. He was formerly the director of the G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture, where Eliza Galloway worked as a domestic servant in the 1880s. And so without further ado, Will.
Hold this. Can you all hear me okay through? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Ty, for that introduction. And as Nathan said, I'm an associate professor of history at UNK. But some of you may know me from about a decade ago now, when I started as director of what was then called the Frank House and is now called the G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture. And some of you might have attended a talk I gave here as one of our very first brown bags about 7 years ago on Eliza Galloway, who I've been interested in for now about a decade. And if you came to that talk, this is not a repeat. There's no information, and we're going to blow your minds regarding her life. Before I get into the meat of the presentation, I wonder how many folks in the room have heard of the name Eliza Galloway in our community? Okay, a decent number of folks. All right. As Nathan mentioned, Eliza Galloway was a domestic servant for the Frank family here in Kearney in the 1890s. This is George and Phoebe Frank. They were the owners of what we now call the Frank Museum, which is located on the west end of the UNK campus. A beautiful historic home. And if you visited the Frank Museum, which has been operating as a museum since about 1975, you very likely would have heard the story of Eliza Galloway told to you by one of the tour guides. And I want to start us there, because I want to start with the narrative as it has been told for a long time in our community. And then we're going to unpack that, okay? So the story of Eliza, as it was told by tour guides at the museum and promoted by the museum in special events and lectures and things for several decades here in our community, went something like this. It varied a little bit, but went something like this. That Eliza Galloway was born enslaved in Maryland prior to the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, she's emancipated and moves to New York. And that while she is in New York, she meets Augustus Frank, who is the brother of George Frank, and coincidentally had been a congressman from Western New York during the Civil War and one of the authors of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Makes it a nice little neat tie, right? Augustus Frank hires her to work for him, sends her to Le Cordon Bleu to learn to be a chef. She then is sent to Kearney to work for George, his brother, who is an industrialist and investor here in the community and has built his big, beautiful home on the west side of town. She becomes the head of household or chief of staff, it's said a couple different ways, head of household or chief of staff for the Frank family, running their domestic servants, okay? All of whom notably are white, other than her. She lives on the second floor of the home, above the kitchen, in a private bedroom, unlike the other domestic servants. A bedroom that the Franks allow her to paint pink, because that's her favorite color. And you would tour the bedroom as part of the museum tour. She is treated practically like a member of the family, according to the tour. When the Franks learn of her marriage to James Galloway, her husband here, her first husband here in Kearney, her second husband overall, they give her a home as a wedding present, because they're landowners and investors, so they have property. They give her a home over by Harmon Park. When they lose all of their money in the Panic of 1893, they give her the family china, and with that family china, she runs a catering business in Kearney. That's the story. It's really grand. And I hear a few folks already chuckling because it doesn't really ring true with our understanding of the experience of African Americans, and especially African American women, in this time period. It seems a little too neat and a little too nice. And so when I first started at the museum, these were a few of the things that I thought sounded kind of questionable in that story. That she fortuitously met Augustus Frank, and in some versions of the story it was on Wall Street, because that's, of course, where you would meet Augustus Frank. That she trains at Le Cordon Bleu. That she's sent to Kearney to work for George and Phoebe. I want to see documentation of that. That she's the head of household or the chief of staff. That seems like a big stretch, because it would have put her over a bunch of white servants in the home. Not likely for the 1890s. That she lived in a bedroom on the second floor of the home, a private bedroom. I'd like to see documentation of that, and that she painted it pink. Love to see documentation of that. That the Franks gave her a home as a wedding gift. That should be documented. That they gave her the family china, and that she ran a catering business in town. I want to see Eliza Galloway's catering company, right? I want to see that catering business. All of these things are things that when I started at the museum seemed a little questionable as part of the story. And so 10 years ago now, almost exactly, I started in September of 2014, so almost exactly 10 years ago now, I started digging into where that story came from, trying to find the documentation in the museum's archives first for how we got to this point. And what I came to realize pretty quickly was that most of the story of Eliza Galloway, as it was being told by the museum, originated in some fashion in a series of letters between Marion Johnson, who's pictured in the upper right here, who was the first curator of the Frank House, and Rosina Stearns, who's pictured with Eliza down below, who knew Eliza when she was about 40 years old in the 1920s, 1930s. Rosina Stearns, coincidentally, is the wife of Lester Stearns, who was one of the superintendents of the Nebraska State Hospital for Tuberculosis, which the Frank House later became. It's all interwoven. Rosina sent a series of letters to Marion in 1975, recalling her memories of Eliza from 40 to 50 years earlier. Eliza died in 1936. Okay? Important thing about Rosina as well is she did not live in Kearney until at least 1910. A full decade after the Franks had left town, a full decade after Eliza had moved on to other things. So the only time period in which it's possible that these two knew each other is about 1910, 1920, when Eliza is about 80 years old, and Rosina is about 30 or 40, and these letters are being written, yet again, 40 to 50 years after that fact, all right? And in the very first letter that Rosina Stearns sends to Marion Johnson on October 23rd, 1975, she says this: I, as well as I believe, everyone who knew Liza, had a real love for her, so I bear these memories I have written down sound extravagant and need careful sifting and discarding for the formal legend you need and will write for your purposes. So she's telling Marion Johnson, you're going to write a legend, and my memories are a little foggy, so you might want to check. And then she goes on to say, if you think best, I feel Edna, which means Edna Baston Donald, with her background of knowledge, would read and discard 9/10 of what I have written. Liza would want to be remembered in her correctness and her dignity. And so to Rosina Stearns' credit, in her recollections, before she even gets into talking about what she recalled Eliza telling her about her life, she says, 90% of what I'm telling you is probably wrong, and you should check it. But they did, and they ran with it. And so we're going to look at a few of the things that Rosina Stearns said about Eliza. And there are kernels of truth in here, and then things that are questionable. So early in the letter, she says Eliza was born in Maryland on an evidently large plantation, backing up the idea that Eliza was born enslaved in Maryland. Large because she talked of the numbers of help, both in the house and in the fields, and the many colored children. She did not know the date of her birth, but she thought she was younger than 10 when she saw her mother sold on the block to one of the bidders, And of course, she never saw or heard from her again. And we will hear this idea of her mother being sold away repeated several times in the documentation. It's one of the few things we feel is probably verifiably true about Eliza's early life, that her mother was sold away while she was still young. But then there are other more questionable aspects of Rosina Stearns' recollections of what Eliza told her about her life on a plantation. She says here, "I do not know the name of the old Mars and the lady of the plantation, but Eliza talked of them with great respect and affection. All went well on the plantation until old Mars died and the sons took over using poor judgment and with extravagance became very much in debt and sold Eliza's mother to pay their indebtedness, a large sum." Going on to say she often talked of the happy life on the plantation. Now, of course, we know that's usually not going to be the case. And of course, this is something that Eliza is telling one of the few white women in the community with whom she is a friend in the 1920s and 1930s, and maybe she's romanticizing the story a little bit, not really talking as truthfully about her experiences on the plantation. We have to take this with a grain of salt and be willing to question it, but there is an interesting bit in here that she had an original enslaver, and that enslaver then transferred her to his two sons. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. She then goes on to say, Eliza, in her late teens, married an older man on the plantation, and they went to New York to live. So we know she has a first husband. We don't know his name, frustratingly, at this point, but we know she has a first husband, and that they moved to New York. He died early, leaving Eliza with two small girls who, in Eliza's words, died in the pest house with smallpox. So she had two children, neither of whom made it out of childhood. Right? Both died of smallpox, according to this account, presumably in New York. But we don't know what her last name was. We don't know what her husband's name was. We don't know what her children's name was. And New York is a large place. So finding her in that would be like finding a needle in a haystack, right? So knowing more about the story seems really hard to do. She often told of one Sunday morning with no food in the house. This is when they're in New York, after her husband has died and she's raising her kids. They'd gone out to look in the windows. A fine-looking white man approached her and asked her, could she wash his fine shirts? Now this is probably the origin of Augustus Frank approaches her on Wall Street. It doesn't say Augustus Frank, it doesn't say Wall Street, it's a fine-looking white man, and it's a weird story. You imagine you're staring at a shop window and a guy walks up to you and says, excuse me, ma'am, would you wash my shirts for me? Seems a little odd, right? Doesn't really pass the smell test. She could and would and continued until after the little girls died, when he asked her to join his household, and it was there she learned her fine cooking under what she said was a famous chef. Not Le Cordon Bleu, a famous chef. When the news of the marvelous development in Nebraska reached them, and Eliza was interested, the man encouraged her to go, and she and a friend left. Not Augustus Frank sent her to live with George and Phoebe, but according to this account, she heard what was happening in Nebraska and decided to go. And he said, sure, go ahead. On the train, her friend, who again, not named, very frustrating. On the train, her friend made a contact and took a position, but Liza continued on, and I believe went almost immediately to the Franks to live in. Not on the second floor, just as a live-in, where she stayed until they went back to New York. The Franks went back to New York after their bankruptcy. They had a sale where fine furniture, art objects, and antiques were sold. Lesser things were given away, some to Liza. Not the family's fine china. Lesser things were given away, some to Liza. Early after Eliza came, she married what she called my husband Galloway, James Galloway, her second husband, who was a Pullman porter on the Union Pacific. They built and established a fine little home near the Third Ward Park with lovely garden trees and happiness until he died of TB. Okay. They built and established a fine little home, not George Frank gave them a home. They built and established a fine little home near Third Ward Park, Harmon Park, okay, northwest side of town, until he dies of tuberculosis. And then there's a later letter after Marion Johnson has written back thanking Rosina Stearns for her recollections, saying this is helping to fill in some of the dots, where Marion has asked her, what role did Eliza play in the home? What was her job? Was she a cook? Was she a maid? Was she a nanny? What did she do? And Rosina writes back, as to your question about Eliza's position in the household as in the Franks, mayor domo comes to my mind, but you'll have a more graceful word. Although because of her unique ability, she did become a person in charge, one of the definitions given in the dictionary. I looked this up. Webster's dictionary defines mayordomo as a person in charge. Rosina Stearns looked at the dictionary and said, "That sounds right," and sent it off. And that's how Eliza becomes head of household and chief of staff. Because a woman said, "Yeah, it sounds like she was probably the mayordomo 40 years after Eliza died," a woman who never knew Eliza when she worked for the Franks and didn't know her until 2 decades afterwards, right? So how trustworthy is that recollection, right? We have to be questioning that kind of recollection. We know our memories are foggy, especially if these kinds of things don't line up with what we believe is the likely experience of a person like Eliza Galloway in that time period, right? So we go back to my list of things that we should question. Did she meet Augustus Frank on Wall Street? Not in the records. Did she train at Le Cordon Bleu? Not in the records. Was she sent to Kearney to work for George and Phoebe Frank? Was she head of household? Did she live in a bedroom on the 2nd floor? Did they give her a house as a wedding gift? What about the family china? What about running a catering business? None of this is in the records of the Frank Museum at all. It's a grand version of the telephone game. You can see the origins of some of these things in the records, right? That she met a man who asked her to wash his shirt, which still is weird, but then that becomes Augustus Frank, right? You can see the origins of some of this, but it's a grand telephone game. And it's a grand telephone game that serves one important purpose here, that I want to be clear about too. It's a telephone game that centers the Franks more than it centers Eliza, right? Augustus Frank rescues her from poverty. They send her to Kearney for a job with his brother. His brother gives her a house. His brother gives him the china that helps her start a catering business. At the center of that story is not Eliza Galloway. At the center of that story is George Frank and Phoebe Frank and Augustus Frank. And it's a story that feels good to a lot of people, especially in the 1970s when the story is initially being crafted. It's post-civil rights movement. People want to feel good about people in their communities past. The Franks are racially progressive. They're tied into the abolition movement. It makes sense, right? Of course they would treat her like an equal. That's not necessarily how abolition happens. It's not necessarily what all abolitionists believe. That's not necessarily the worldview of many people at all in 1890s America, but it is what people in the 1970s might have wanted to believe about the Franks and about their relationship with Eliza. So 10 years ago, questioning a lot of the story that was in the museum, I started digging through the records that are available to try to understand a little bit more about her life. Okay? And one of the first places I turned to was the official records that we might have. Right? So census records are a great set of documents to help us understand a little bit more about the lives of everyday people who otherwise, like Eliza, don't leave a record behind. Right? So this clip at the top is the census record from 1900. Those of you, a couple students of mine that are in the room know that I always bemoan the absence of the 1890 census, which is the height of the Franks. It was burned in a fire many decades ago and would tell us a whole heck of a lot more about Kearney if it still existed. But we do have the 1900 census. And the 1900 census shows Eliza, right here. Eliza, married to James Galloway, head of household, she's the wife, living at, it's hard to read, but that's 518 West 28th Street in Kearney. He is born in about 1850. She's born about 1855. This census records vary all the time. She's born somewhere around 1850, 1855, depending on what record you look at. She's from Maryland. That lines up. He's from Virginia. He's a conductor, a Pullman porter, which lines up with Rosina Stearns' account. But she's a laundress. Not running a catering business. She's a laundress. And interestingly, this little F here, they own their own home. That's what the O means. The F means freely owned. It's not mortgage. They paid for it by that. What's also interesting here is that there's a third resident in their home in 1900. A guy named John Logan, who's a boarder, who's black, male black. He's 18 years of age, born in Nebraska, and a local waiter. There's a very small black community in Kearney, about 8 to 12 people in 1900, and one of those people is living with James and Eliza Galloway in their home as a renter, as a boarder, looking for a place to live. This incidentally is their house. You can still see it today, 518 West 28th Street. Okay? This is a photograph of her at her home in the backyard. Doesn't quite line up because she's behind the house in this photo. Apparently loved to garden. So this is already starting to tell us more about her life, that she's connected with a broader Black community here in Kearney that goes unmentioned in the traditional story. We can look at marriage licenses. And there are 2 marriage licenses for Eliza Galloway at Buffalo County Historical Society. She was married 3 times. 3 times. James Galloway is her second husband. We know that off of Rosina Stearns' recollections. And this is her marriage license to James Galloway in 1893. In March of 1893, March 17th. James J. Galloway and Eliza Riley. Galloway is identified as being born in West Virginia. And Eliza is being identified, very frustratingly here, this set us off on a wild goose chase for a bit, as being born in Hancock, Nebraska. She's not born in Nebraska. That was very annoying for a while. His parents are named, hers unknown. Unknown. Which lines up with what we had been told, that she didn't know her parents' names. But there are also still, again, here hints that James and Eliza Galloway are connected with a broader Black community in central Nebraska. This family, one of the witnesses to their wedding, is George W. Buxom, who is the founder of the Black Masonic Lodge in Grand Island and a boxer in Grand Island, semi-pro boxer, in black. So they're connected with a community in Grand Island. They're probably connected with the Black community in Hastings. They're connected with the kind of small but well-connected Black community in the region. James, we know, dies of TB. We've already had that mentioned by Rosina Stearns. Here's her second marriage license to Frank Redd in the 1920s, 1922. Frank Redd is from Pensacola, Florida. She, though, now is not from Hancock, Nebraska. She's from Hancock, Maryland. Error in the record. That's an interesting clue. Hancock, Maryland is on the very thinnest part of Maryland between the Potomac River or across the Potomac River from Virginia. So if you picture Maryland, how it thins out and then widens, Hancock's in that part that's about 2 miles wide. A really thin part, right there. And she gives names for her mother and father, which is weird because she doesn't give names for them here. So does she remember them? We don't know. She gives Berger Sprigg for her father, and Bozeman for her mother. And unfortunately, at this point, I will say, nothing has come of that yet. We've not been able to make any connections on that thus far. But she does give some names. We can look at probate records and wills as well. On the left here, we have James Galloway's will, shortly before he dies in about 1903 or so, of tuberculosis. He says, I, James Galloway, do hereby make, publish, and declare this, as in for my last will and testament. I hereby devise to my wife, Eliza Galloway, my residence situate in the city of Kearney, and I give and bequeath to my said wife, Eliza, all of the other property, real and personal, of which I might die seized. So he gives her, on his death, his home, their home, and all of their possessions. Okay? But then we have Eliza's will, written about 23 years later, 1926. At the time in which she's still married to Frank Redd, which is interesting because among other things, she talks about where she wants to be buried, given a decent burial in the Galloway lot of Kearney Cemetery, where this guy's buried. And she says, and I love this, I give unto my husband Frank Redd, provided that he is living with me at the time of my death, such a portion of my estate as the statutes of the state of Nebraska would give to him should he demand it and no more. They get divorced like a year later. She never talks about him, as far as we know. And she is buried with her second husband as a Galloway, not as a Redd. Okay? And interestingly, tantalizingly, she gives us another rabbit trail we might trace, saying, all the rest of my estate shall be left of every kind I direct to be paid to Etta Davis, a niece of mine, and is the daughter of the sister Sarah Davis being a sister of James Galloway, my former husband. So she has not blood relatives, but relatives by marriage that we might try to track down as well. She also lives until 1936, which means she lives through at least a portion of the Great Depression, and so received aid during the Great Depression from the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA. And these are also at Buffalo County Historical Society. I just clipped a couple little bits of it, but here again we have Galloway, James Galloway, Eliza Galloway, he's deceased. She doesn't know, probably 90 years old is what that says. Lives at 518 West 28. Gives, interestingly, a maiden name of Spriggs. She gave her father's name as Sprague. We still, again, have not been able to track down what that might mean yet, but there's some tantalizing possibilities there. And here's a record of her seeking aid at the time. Talking about how she needs assistance for fuel, how she's worried that she's not going to be able to pay her taxes, how she had lost all of her savings and investments, and in the 2 bank failures years earlier. She's destitute in the latter years of her life. She dies a year after this. Not even a year, like 6 months after this. She's given coal. I think this is an interesting line. Mrs. Galloway states she has sold some rare old pieces of silver and china for a little cash, which will enable her to supply her own fuel for a while. Now, we don't know where she got that china, but it's entirely possible. Maybe some of the knickknacks she inherited from the Franks are sold off there. Just don't know for sure. And then we have what she tells the nuns at Good Sam. She dies at Good Sam in 1936, in March of 1936, again about 6 months or so after that FERA document. And she says there, or they record, Eliza Galloway, an old negress, well over 90 years old, was admitted to hospital. She had been a field slave and distinctly recalls her slavery days, how her father and mother had been separated. We're getting multiple accounts of her father and mother being separated. That makes it highly likely that it happened. Right? Her father and mother had been separated because they had been sold to different masters, how she saw her mother put up and sold at auction. Again, that's being recounted multiple times by multiple different people. And she declares that the cruelties described in Uncle Tom's Cabin are not exaggerated. So it wasn't great on the plantation. She's telling the nuns it's really bad, that Uncle Tom's Cabin is just the beginning, right? Very different story than what she supposedly told Rosina Stearns, or what Rosina Stearns remembered her telling her, right? She well remembers the emancipation when President Lincoln freed the slaves as well, right? We can also look at newspaper accounts from the time, from the Kearney Hub. And Eliza is mentioned a few times in the Hub, off and on. Not often in long verbiage. And so I just want to highlight a couple articles in particular where we get a lot of information about her, both approaching the time of her death. February 22nd, 1936, the Hub publishes a long article about Eliza, calling her a Kearney caterer, when she's ill and laying dying at Good Sam. She has stomach cancer. And so she's in the hospital for a couple months. And among other things, long article, it's just at the beginning of it, they say a few interesting things per our narrative. One is, in the dim past, Eliza has changed the panties of literally dozens of Kearney's now prominent businessmen, which is one heck of a way to be remembered. And years later, she baked their wedding cakes and later still cared for their children. That is not a catering business. That is a domestic servant, and a nanny, and a maid, and all the things that an African-American woman could most reasonably do in a place like Kearney in 1910, 1920. That's what she's doing. She's not running a catering business. She's a domestic servant. That's how she's being remembered. She never intended to come to Kearney, which is a pretty blunt way of saying they didn't send her here. She never intended to come to Kearney. At the Midway Hotel, which was a grand hotel that sat in what is now the parking lot of Grand Apple Market, burned down, was rebuilt and then torn down. At the Midway Hotel, she met James Galloway. He conducted a nifty, shining stand at the hotel. Romance called, and they enjoyed many happily years of wedded life. So we have more information about her meeting James at the Midway Hotel. Reads boot black and a Pullman Porter. And then lastly, her home, a modest but neat residence at 518 West 28th Street, was paid for long ago by her savings. Not George and Phoebe Frank gave it to her. She paid for the house herself, according to the newspaper. We also get this kind of odd letter. There's this guy named K.A. Hinote who grew up in Kearney when Eliza lived here and worked with the Franks, who left Kearney, lived in New York, hears that she's on her deathbed and writes her a letter, and then the Kearney Hub publishes it in March of 1936. She's actually died like 2 days before this is published. And a lot of it's, we were friends, and I remember this, I remember knowing you back in the day. But there's this one interesting line that I wanted to highlight where he says, "I always thought more of you and Jim, I mean Mr. Galloway, than you ever knew. Of course, I was young and full of old Nick when I met Jim at the Midway, and through him I met you." So Jim's working at the Midway. "At that time, you was known as Mrs. Riley." Mrs. Riley, which we'd seen in that initial marriage license to James Galloway, an earlier last name, and was working for the Franks that lived just west of town. This is incidentally the only piece of documentation we have from someone who knew Eliza Galloway at the time in which she was working for the Franks that says she worked for the Franks. That's it. That's the only mention from someone who actually knew her when she worked for the Franks. So it's very tenuous, but we do know she probably did work for them. But the newspapers also reveal that there's parts of her story that weren't being told by the museum, in the recollections, anywhere. And that's what happened to her husband, James, especially. There's other aspects too, but James is a big part of this, so I want to highlight. All the recollections that I've recounted to you so far, it talks about their happy marriage until he dies of TB, that they lived in marital bliss, right? All of this, right? But in 1903, James Galloway is actually arrested in downtown Kearney. Again, he was working as a bootblack at the Midway Hotel. He worked as a Pullman porter. He was doing, assisting people on hunting trips in the region, carrying their guns and things for them. And one day, according to the Hub, in August of 1903, he started around town trying to borrow money from different merchants, but did not have success. No one in town, no merchant in town is giving him a loan. We don't know why, but we do know he's African American. We do know blacks are routinely denied loans in this time period. He did not have much success. He then went round to different stores and purchased a miscellaneous assortment of different things. He had a gun with him and threatened to kill a prominent businessman. Since gone and located, this would have happened right next door to the World Theater, in the same block as the World Theater. Threatened to kill a prominent businessman, imagining that he had wronged him, so the officers concluded it best to take care of him. So he's arrested by the Kearney police. He is accused on this one incident, primarily, of insanity. And rather than being put in a criminal trial, he is put before the County Insane Commission, which declares him insane and sentences him for life to the Hastings Insane Asylum, where he dies of TB a year later, 6 months later. So that's the full story. So he's incarcerated on some fairly dubious charges of insanity at the State Insane Asylum in Hastings and dies there. Never gets mentioned. Doesn't get mentioned by the tour, doesn't get mentioned by Rosina Stearns, doesn't get mentioned in any of the recollections, because it's an uncomfortable aspect of the story to talk about. And that's where I was like 7 years ago. With a lot of questions, not enough answers, a lot of contradictory information, and trying to figure out what is right or what is more accurate. And it was a big old brick wall. And I went away, left Kearney, came back, took this job. And about 6 months ago, Dr. Ty and I were sitting at Kit's Coffee House, and I decided that I wanted to pull this story up again, maybe write an article on it. And I started looking through digitized copies of the Kearney Hub in the 1990s and 2000s. Because I wanted documentation of the story that the Frank Museum was telling. I wanted the announcements of, oh, we're having a bake sale for head of household Eliza Galloway, which they did. These sorts of things. And I found this article, which is not about the Frank Museum, but is in fact about a woman named Helen Kimball, or Helen Kendall Jensen, who's Helen Kendall was her maiden name, who grew up in Kearney in the 1920s, who was a journalist for, of all things, the Kearney High School newspaper, The Echo. As it says here, the Hub already had published some of her Echo stories, including an interview with a local black woman, Eliza Galloway, who had been a slave as a child. And this was the thing we were missing. Because in all of the stuff that I've showed you so far, where has Eliza Galloway's voice been? Absent, right? It's recollections from people who knew her. It's the Hub talking about what was going on in the community, but newspapers are notoriously inaccurate. It's official documents, right? Her voice is not there. And it is almost impossible to find the voices of people from 100 years ago who were lower class, working class, black women. I never thought we'd find her voice. And so I never thought we'd really know her true story, because her voice is the best way to learn about her experience. And here was a hint that a high school student in 1928 had decided to interview the aging, by that point she's in her 80s, Eliza Galloway, for the local high school newspaper. And there are very few issues of the high school newspaper still existing. Most of them are over at Buffalo County Historical Society, but Dr. Ty did me a solid and ran over there right after we found this, and he found the interview where Aunt Elsa Galloway, misspelled, high school newspapers, Aunt Elsa Galloway read tells her early life. Okay? They do spell her name correctly in the next line. This is a column and a half of a conversation between Eliza Galloway, who again at that point is about 80 years of age, and Helen Kendall at Eliza Galloway's house at 518 West 20th Street. And the reason this is a big deal is it throws out basically everything the museum had been saying up until this point. I'm going to highlight a few of the more interesting aspects of her oral history and why it's so important we have her voice, not what other people said about her. On her childhood, this is what she says. I was born, she began, at Hancock, Maryland, a place between the Potomac River and Virginia. My mother belonged to a man named Jacob Ligle. We have a name of the person who enslaved her. Jacob Ligle. My father belonged to another man and lived 10 miles away, but every Saturday night he was allowed to come and see my mother. My mother was a very good woman, and when a man from Alabama offered my master a great deal of money for her, he sold her. So again, corroborating that her mother was sold off. My father never knew about it until he came next Saturday night and found her gone. All the colored children on the plantation were put in one cabin together. The older folks were made to work at the house. Nobody who hasn't seen it can understand how awful it was. Not it was a pleasant experience, how awful it was. Her mother's sold away. Her family is separated. Her father is only allowed to visit once a week and lives 10 miles away. What was especially tantalizing to me, though, and stuck out to me, was that we have this name. We never had a name for her enslaved. And so it was always a shot in the dark to who knows where near Hancock, Maryland she grew up. And so I started doing a little bit of digging. You're going to have to work with me here because it's a high school journalist. So Ligle, it's a high school journalist translating an illiterate, older African-American woman's rendition of what she thinks her enslaver's name was when she was 8. Okay? So it may not be the right spelling. We're going to go with that. Jacob Ligle is the name she gives, though. This is a 1860s property map. 1860 property map of Washington County, Maryland, which is the county where Hancock is located, and I've zoomed in on Hancock itself. Again, this is the narrowest spit of Maryland, and there's the town of Hancock. This map shows all the different property owners around Hancock in 1860. And there's one name that stands out, because it's definitely not Bowles, it's definitely not Brent. Those don't sound close to Ligle, but Slagle's fairly close. And that first letter is J. And Jacob's a pretty easy name to remember. So I wonder if that's a Jacob. J. Slagle's heirs. J. Slagle's heirs. So then I go to the census records, and I look specifically at the slave census in 1860, which documents the enslaved people on different properties in Maryland. And this is 1860, John and Jacob Slagle. Jacob Slagle. And and he is enslaving, among others, an 8 to 10-year-old girl. Eliza Galloway was born about 1850. At the start of the Civil War, she would have been about 8 or 10 years old. So you got to wonder, is that maybe her? Or one of these may be her, right? Interestingly as well, remember that story from Rosina Stearns that the original master of the plantation had died and that he had transferred ownership of his enslaved persons to his sons, J. Slagle's heirs, John and Jacob Slagle. Well, it turns out that John and Jacob Slagle's dad is also named Jacob Slagle. And I traveled to Maryland in April of this last year, with support from the Frank Museum, where I dug through the property records and appraisal of Jacob Slagle's estate when he dies in 1857. And what do we find? A girl, Eliza, valued at $400. Now, we will never know with absolute certainty that that is Eliza Galloway. But she gives the name of her enslaver as Jacob Lagle. There's a Jacob Slagle in the community, and he's enslaving a girl named Eliza in that time period. That is very likely her. And then she is passed, when he dies in 1857, to his 2 sons, John and Jacob Slagle. Okay? So we found her in that early part of her life, almost certainly, in the documentary record now, courtesy of that oral history. She goes on to say, returning to her own life, in the war, my father went off with a bunch of soldiers, which is very tantalizing and we still don't know a whole lot about. The part of Maryland she's living in is being run over by Confederates multiple times on their way to Antietam, on their way to Gettysburg. They're taking enslaved persons as contraband of war and forcing them to work for the Confederate Army. Is that what's going on here? Or did her father join the USCT, the U.S. Colors Troops, to fight against the Confederacy? We don't know. She doesn't give enough information. She's very frustrating and something we're going to keep working on. Afterwards, he heard of my mother down in Alabama and went to her. There's a family reunification story there. Maybe the Freedmen's Bureau is involved. He goes and tracks down her mother, who had been sold away down to Alabama, and finds her. We heard from them until the big flood down in Alabama, but that was the last we knew of them. So she even stayed in touch with her family, stayed in touch with her parents after the war. We don't know for certain what big flood she's talking about, but there is an enormous flood that kills a number of people, an unknown number of people in Montgomery, Alabama in 1886, which is likely what she's talking about. It was a historic flood. The river was like 160 feet deep. She also talks about the post-war years in her oral history. She says, after the war, I lived with my aunt and uncle in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, until I was about 18 years old. So she moves north of the border to an aunt and uncle unnamed. Haven't yet found them. And then says, when I was 18, I married a man named Mr. Riley and moved to Jersey City, not New York, specifically Jersey City. There I had 2 daughters. One of them died when she was 5 years old, and the other lived to be 17 and then died of smallpox. So corroborating Rosina Stearns' story that she had 2 children who died young. Smallpox in those days was different from smallpox we have now. As a friend of mine said the other day, that was the real smallpox. Don't do that. After Mr. Riley's death, I worked for a man named Isaac Long. So we have a name for Riley, we have Isaac Long, an employer, and instead of New York, we have Jersey City. And so we pull the census records. And this top one's going to be really hard to read, but this is Eliza in a census record. In Jersey City. It's a blurry record. This is the 1880 census. This is up here, it's hard to read again, is Joseph Riley. This is Eliza Riley and a 10-year-old girl named Annie, which is probably her daughter. Eliza is documented as keeping house. Joseph, we now have a first name, is a railroad clerk, and their daughters at school. And they live at 357 West 4th Street in Jersey City. Which is that building. Maybe that's them, maybe it's not. Riley is actually spelled R-E-I-L-Y here instead of R-I-L-E-Y, but again, census records make mistakes all the time. So to corroborate that, we also look up Isaac Long. She said she worked for Isaac Long. Well, Isaac Long lives in Jersey City as well in 1880. He's an egg dealer. Interesting job. And most interestingly, he lives about 3 blocks from her. So, you know, that very well could be her. Almost certainly could be her. Right? I'm coming to Nebraska. She says, we kept hearing about how you could pick up gold on the streets of California. So after a few years, a Scotch woman named Mary Jensen, that's the mysterious friend Rosina Stearns was talking about. A Scotch woman named Mary Jensen and I bought tickets and started out to California, not to Nebraska. The hub was right. She didn't want to go to Nebraska, she wanted to go to California. On the train, we met Mr. Judge and Mr. Both of these men were prominent during Kearney's boom. They told us to stop at Kearney instead of going to California, and they could get lots of work for us, but we had paid for tickets to California, and we didn't want to waste our money. They said they could sell our tickets easily enough for us, though, so we decided to stay at Kearney. That's the story. Some local boosters say, you should stop at Kearney. We'll pay the rest of your way. Don't worry about it. We'll make sure you don't lose your money. That's the story she tells. She then goes on to say, in Kearney, I worked for Mr. Martin, who was later the editor of a magazine. And then I met Mr. Galloway. We were married and went to Hot Springs, South Dakota. We left our things in the Midway Hotel, and they burned up when the fire came. After a while, we came back to Kearney and built this house. There were no houses for blocks around here then, and all the land was grown up in sunflowers. There's a lot to unpack here. She travels with a woman named Mary Jensen. She meets a Mr. Judd, and Mr. Farkin. She works for a Mr. Martin. She meets Galloway, goes to Hot Springs, South Dakota. She's living in the Midway Hotel, not the Frank House, in the Midway Hotel when they get married. And all of their possessions are there because they're burned in the fire. And then they go and build their home in Kearney. Very different from the story that had traditionally been told. And because she gives us names, we know who some of these people are. Mr. Judd is almost certainly E.M. Judd, who was the president of the Midway Land Company, one of the biggest boosters in the community. Would have been friends with the Franks, almost certainly, absolutely certainly. Not a Frank, though. But E.M. Judd is, one of the big boosters, one of the big landowners, one of the guys involved in developing Kearney in that time period. Mr. Martin is Dr. O.S. Martin, who is editor of Success Magazine. She said he was editor of magazine. He's editor of Success Magazine. Remember, he's pretty good on that. He was also the proprietor of the Midway Hotel. Starts to connect more. James Galloway worked in the Midway Hotel as a bootblack for Mr. Martin. Eliza Galloway worked for Dr. Martin. How did they meet? At the Midway. And Mary Jensen gets a mention, the Scottish one. Miss Mary Jensen of Hot Springs, South Dakota, that's how we know it's Hot Springs, South Dakota, is visiting Miss James Galloway. So this Scottish woman that she had traveled to Kearney with, later leaves Kearney, moves to Hot Springs, South Dakota, periodically visits Eliza and James Galloway, which is a very interesting friendship for that time period. And Eliza and James decide to honeymoon in Hot Springs, where their good friend, the Scottish lady Mary Jensen, is living. Kind of a cool story. And while all their possessions are burned in the Midway. She also gives us a sense of a woman who is far more worldly and traveled than the Frank Museum tour would have necessarily made you think. She mentions early on in her account that she has a photograph in her home of herself and Joseph Riley, her first husband, at the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883 in Jersey. If anybody finds that photograph, please let me know. If you find a photo of two black people standing in front of the Brooklyn Bridge, let me know. I really would love to find that, because it was here in the community, at least until the 1930s. She mentions that after Mr. Galloway died, she traveled to California and says, I didn't like it a bit out there. Came back and then traveled to Maryland, where she also didn't like it, and then came back to Kearney. So she's traveling across the country. She says that I lived here in Kearney for 42 years now, but during that time I've been to Canada and traveled all around. I like Kearney best. She's gone over to Canada on a vacation. And one of my favorites, the article notes at the very end of the article, so this is not Eliza Galloway's words, this is the Helen Kendall, noting that another interesting keepsake that Eliza had in her house was a necktie made of finely spun glass woven together. This had come from the Chicago Exposition. She'd been at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. A lot more than a domestic servant. She's a well-traveled woman. She's going to Canada, Chicago's World Fair, going to California, visiting family in Maryland or West Virginia. She also gives us a sense of the black community in Kearney and what's happened to that community. Because remember, in 1900, there's like a dozen or so African-American residents in the community, but at the time of her death in 1936, it's repeated time and time again, she's the only black person living in Kearney. The only one. And so this, again, about 8 years before her death, she says, there used to be 8 colored families in town, but now there's only one, and they're planning to move away. And I guess I'll stay here till they haul me out, which is a ringing endorsement of Kearney. Now, we don't know why the black community of Kearney had declined yet, exactly. But it is worth noting that the time period that she's talking about, between 1900, when she's part of this community that's interconnected with Grand Island and other things, in 1930, there is a rising Klan in this region. There is a rising anti-black movement in this region. And just 1 year after she gives this oral history, North Platte, a white mob in North Platte will chase out the entire black population of that community. So there is resentment against African Americans in the community that may have been part of the reason for why that community had continued to decline and why she was the last black person left when she died. Also important to keep in mind when we think about the recollection she's giving and how comfortable she would feel talking as openly about her experiences with others in the community. Right? So that leaves us with a whole different picture of who Eliza Galloway was, right? Not the story that we had been telling for a long time at the Frank Museum. That oral history changes our perspective entirely, right? Who Eliza Galloway is now, we know she was born enslaved near Hancock, Maryland, enslaved by a man named Jacob Schlegel, and later by his sons, John and Jacob. And she's emancipated at the end of the Civil War, not by the Emancipation Proclamation, because that didn't apply to Maryland, but by the 13th Amendment. And that she then travels north to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where she lives with some family until she meets and marries Joseph Riley, her first husband. They then move to Jersey City, New Jersey, where they have 2 children, one of whom we know is named Annie, all of whom do not make it to adulthood. Joseph also dies. She works briefly as a domestic servant for Isaac Long, maybe that white man on the street, we don't know for sure. But she works briefly for a man named Isaac Long before befriending a Scottish immigrant named Mary Jensen and deciding to go to California and getting convinced by some Kearney boosters to stop here instead, which is still kind of weird. She's interconnected then almost immediately into the prominent community here in Kearney that is boosting the town because she knows and works for the owner of the Midway Hotel. She works briefly for the Frank family. Noticeably, she never mentions the Franks in her own oral history. She works for them, and she works for a number of other families in the community as a domestic servant. And she works as a domestic servant for families in the community for most of the rest of her life until she dies in the 1930s. She travels. She goes to the Chicago World's Fair. She goes to Canada. She goes to California. She goes to Hot Springs to visit her friend. That's a much more human picture. It's a picture that decenters the Franks entirely because she didn't center the Franks. She doesn't choose to center them in her own retelling of her life. It's a picture that centers herself and her experiences and her travels and her family, her husband, James. She still doesn't mention Frank. Red, the third husband. I don't know what happened there. But she's a human. It was a human story, a set of human experiences. And I want to wrap you up with throwing back to Rosina Stearns here, who said in that first letter that Eliza would want to be remembered in her correctness and in her dignity. And I think the best way we can remember her in her correctness and in her dignity is not with a myth that makes people feel comfortable, but with the story that she actually told about herself. Right. That's all I have. Questions? Yeah.
2 questions. When was the fire in Midway when they lost all their possessions?
93, 94?
Did that coincide with her wedding date?
Pretty cool. Yeah. She's married in early 1893, and the Midway burns down around about that.
And what did you say the address of the
518 West 28th Street.
It's still there.
Yep, you can visit that. Well, don't. You can drive by the house. Don't scare the owners. I have to go scare the owners. That's the thing.
Where is that photo?
All right, yeah. So this is the Roby house. This is a photo that Dr. Ty found as part of his own research. This is the house on the northeast corner of Pioneer Park. It was up for sale recently with a big star on the front porch. It's a big, large house. She was a domestic for the Roby family, among others, but he likes this one because she was a domestic along with Henry Chung, who, if you came to his talk, you would remember was involved in the liberation movement for South Korea. Okay. So actually, Rosina Stearns mentions Eliza knowing a well-bred Korean kid and teaching him how to be a good domestic as part of her recollections, and I think that probably is Henry Chung. So that's another weird connection.
But this photo's in Seoul, Korea.
Yeah, the
In
photo
the
itself
National
is in
Archive.
Korea.
Which is not where, again, you expect to find, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the Henry Chung papers in Korea. So who knows what else is in the Henry Chung papers in Korea about her?
Where is she buried, and why the different spelling on that headstone?
Yeah, so she's buried in the Kearney Cemetery, and I don't know exactly why they misspelled her name, but it doesn't speak, to her being as well known as they try to make her out to be. But it's just an error on the headstone.
So how did he get from the insane asylum back to Kearney Cemetery?
He's buried.
Well, I know,
Yeah.
but they didn't bury him in the TB sort of cemetery. They brought him back.
As far as I know, yeah.
Did Lori have any, is she here? Is Lori?
Oh, Lori Potter?
Yeah, did she have any more to say about her interview with Helen, right?
No, I mean, I haven't really talked to Lori about it, but Helen's, I want to get back to the original source, right? So the most important thing about Lori Potter interviewing Helen Kimball is
Is
Helen
that she
Kimball
takes
saying
it
that I
back to-
interviewed Eliza Galloway. Which, honestly, that's part of the fun of that is Eliza's story had been so publicized by the Frank Museum by the late 90s. And you could go to bake sales to fundraise to restore Eliza's bedroom and all sorts of stuff. That the romanticization of her story is probably why Helen Kimball even mentioned it. Because people in the community would have known her name in the 1990s. And, oh, yeah, I knew who that was. So we might have actually benefited from her being so romanticized that it gets mentioned in this interview in the 90s. I can tell you I would never have gone looking through the Kearney High newspaper for an interview with Eliza Galloway. We might have stumbled across it by accident eventually, but that's certainly an odd place to find the big missing key. The pink bedroom thing I was talking to April about here a second ago, that's another fun one that we think we can kind of unpack now. She may have lived in the house based on the accounts that we have. But the idea that she had her own private bedroom on the second floor, like none of that really holds up. And the idea that the Franks let her paint her room pink, like it's a dorm room, in a multi-million-dollar mansion is interesting. It doesn't hold up. But the origin of that, we believe, is that when the hospital takes over the house in the early 1900s, the hospital goes through and repaints the whole home, and their favorite colors are green, blue, and pink. And so there is pink on the walls in the room that was being interpreted as Eliza Galloway's bedroom, but it is almost certainly the hospital pink, not Eliza Galloway's favorite color. Yeah.
So what's next, if you can tell us, like what do you have planned, do you have anything planned next?
Yeah, I mean, so there's still more names to trace. I want to try to track the Galloway family line, because there is mention of some siblings of James Galloway, his parents, the niece that stuff's supposed to go. I want to see if I can find descendants and whatnot through that line, since we know Eliza has no lineal descendants herself. And then, there's still more threads to tease regarding the research, but eventually I want to publish something about this and just kind of reinterpreting the story and the importance of having somebody's actual voice in knowing what their story is. Why you can't just rely on secondhand accounts. Yeah.
What race would be her friend, her Scottish friend?
Probably
Black?
white, but
You'd think Scottish it would be white, but in this era to have two women traveling of different races seems not common.
It definitely would not be common, but the fact that she says it herself makes it hard to dismiss, right? So, yeah. Henry?
Loaded rhetorical question, Will.
Yeah?
Why is it so important to dig at some of these romanticized, well-loved stories in museums? To get to the truth.
Well, because it matters more than the feel-good story, right? But it goes to this last slide, that we need to remember these histories and the experiences of these people for what they were, not for the story that feels good, but for what they were. And all its warts and oddities, whether that's her friendship with Mary Jensen, which is odd to be sure, or that's the incarceration of her husband in the state insane asylum. All right, well, thank you all for coming. Oh, one more.
Is there any way to tie and follow, because her will wanted things to go to her niece and nephew from James Galloway? Is there any way to tie and connect? I mean, where even would his sister?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of tracing down that side of the family. Of course, it's also worth noting that that will is written in 1926 before the financial collapse. And then the federal emergency relief records indicate that she lost all of her money and was selling off all of her stuff. So I don't know how much she died actually owning. It may not be very much at all, other than the house. All right, well, thank you all for coming.